Good evening. Welcome to the March 1st, 2021 Westerville City Schools Board of Education work session. Though providing an opportunity for public comment during school board meetings is not a requirement, the Westerville City School District Board of Education believes it's an important part of its engagement with and accountability to the community. As part of our mitigation efforts to slow the spread of the coronavirus, and in the spirit of maintaining an opportunity for our public to participate in these virtual school board meetings, we are offering interested persons an opportunity to submit written public comment. During a typical Westerville City School District Board of Education meeting, there are two opportunities for individuals to address the board. During this evening's work session, there will be one opportunity for public comment. While functioning under this virtual meeting environment, the opportunity to submit public comment has been open since 5:30 p.m. and will close shortly after the public comment section is reached on the agenda. Per Board Policy 0169.1, each statement made by a participant shall be limited to 5 minutes duration. When submitting your comments through the provided forms, we ask you to please keep your comments professional, avoid the use of inappropriate language, and refrain from identifying individuals by name in the event of a complaint. And you may use the links provided on the board's website to submit public comments. All comments submitted become a matter of public record and are subject to release under Ohio law and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. As with in-person public comments made during a traditional school board meeting, members reserve the right to respond immediately or withhold comment in order to conduct appropriate research and follow up with the speaker at a later time. Thank you in advance for your understanding and cooperation. And the meeting will now be called to order. Ms. Marshall, would you please call the roll?
Mrs. Altman?
Here.
Mrs. Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Velardo?
Here.
Dr. Nussbaker?
Here.
Mr. Bell?
Here. Item 3 on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. If you would please stand and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President, a little point of order. Are you all on camera? Are you on right now?
Yes.
We're not on
We're not on
so
Zoom.
We're not clicking into anything.
Correct.
Okay. Just use your microphone. I just wanted to make sure. We used to do this way back when. I'm confused. All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, because we want you to have clarity.
Well, that should
Okay. Agenda item 4.01. Temporarily suspend board policy PO 0169.1, public participation at Board of Education meetings. May I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Second. You can have it.
Any discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Marshall, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Velardo?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Nussbaker?
Yes.
Mr. Bell?
Yes. Motion carries. Agenda item 5.01, public comments. We have not received any. Agenda item 6.01, resolution to suspend Robert's Rules of Order for items number, I believe, 7.01. May I have a motion and a second?
So moved. Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Marshall, would you please call the roll?
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Dr. Nestor Baker?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes.
Mr. Velardo?
Yes.
Mr. Bell?
Yes. Motion carries. Next item on the agenda, 7.01, board development conversation. And with that, this evening, our purpose is to have a discussion around board operations and how the board is currently structured and how we believe as a board that relates to the organizational chart and recent developments and changes that have taken place there, and to ensure that we have alignment between how the board is organized and how we operate as that relates to the district's current organizational chart and operations. So we'll have a discussion around our board liaison model and how we believe that works, any changes or adjustments that we think need to be made to that, and also discuss our expectations of one another as we serve in the capacity as liaisons for the board. And so I thought it would be good for us to begin that conversation this evening by asking Dr. Nestor Baker and Mr. Hershiser if you would share with us a little bit about the history of the board liaison model, how that was implemented, has been implemented here in Westerville City School District, and how that's been practiced over time.
Happy to do that. And Mark, jump in whenever. All right? And then when you talk, I'll jump in when you're talking. How about that? All right. So Mark and I were going back and forth. How long have the liaisons been in play here? You know, how long has the board been using them? Was there any big break in them, anything like that? So he and I both thought it was probably in the early 90s, because I knew it was in force when I first went on the board in 91. And so Jennifer Ferris, bless her heart, it's not as if she didn't have anything else to do. She went back through years and years of board agendas and found that the first liaison vote that she could find in any board agendas actually was in 1976. So the district has been using the liaison model steadily and consistently since 1976. So I mentioned to Mark earlier this evening that takes us across 6.5 superintendents. And no, John, I'm not counting you as a half a superintendent. One person was an interim superintendent for just a few months, so I'm giving him a half. But it was interesting to me. I was surprised. I knew it was well embedded all those years ago. Didn't realize how embedded it was. Basically, the liaison model is designed and implemented in this district to provide a conduit between the board and the administration. We typically work with the administrator or administrators who have responsibility in a particular area that we are liaising in. It's not designed as a substitution for board action. It's not designed for one particular board member to rule any particular area. It is very much just a conduit, and it allows for a perspective to be shared from board members to administrators that they might not otherwise have. Actually, multiple perspectives. The perspective of what board members may think, see, question about a particular area of operations, but also to help us as we fulfill our role as a bridge within the community, a bridge between the school system itself and the community at large. So it allows us to bring different perspectives, sometimes non-educator perspectives, sometimes perspectives from groups that the administrators may not have heard from. And it's a good way to broaden understanding both on the part of the board members and the board at large, as a whole, and also on the part of the administration as well. I have lost track of the number of times I'll say something to administrator and they'll say, oh, I hadn't heard that. I wasn't aware of that. And they'll say something to me and I'll say, oh, I hadn't heard that. I wasn't aware of that. It's very, very helpful in that way. It's not that common a model. Boards typically will operate either as a committee of the whole or with subcommittees of board members, where you have, in our case, because of Sunshine Law, 2 board members who interact with a particular area. Now, right now, we do have, and we have had the last couple of years, a couple of board members who are engaged in the same liaison areas, but it's not done as subcommittees of the board per se. Now, for us, as I've thought about the liaison model, and I've thought about it a lot of times over the years, because I was really surprised when I found out that not every school district, I am echoing like I'm in, I don't know, Carnegie Hall. But when I found out not every school district uses a liaison model, it seems to have served us well thus far because it meets our culture. Every school district has a lot of things that are the same, but every school district derives itself from its own community's culture. And for us, as I thought about it, I thought, okay, why does it work? Why does it work? In some ways it works because board members here, and they are in other places, but I'm talking just about Westerville right now, we are deeply invested and deeply involved at both the community level and, hard as it is for our administrators sometimes, at the administrative level. And the liaison model helps us keep those engagements and those involvements on an even playing field. And it allows us to exercise the responsibilities that our community expects from us in this particular school district in a way that, as I said earlier, builds those bridges. It's very much a bridge building model. The nice thing about the liaison model is it can be somewhat less formal than a committee of the board. So, for instance, if we had a committee of the board for HR, we would then have to set up these formal meetings, and we would have to announce the meetings, and we would have to keep minutes of the meetings, and we would have to adhere to the Sunshine Law. We have to do all of those things and not just sit down and talk. And the liaison model lets us just sit down and talk and pick up the phone and just talk. Doesn't mean that just because I'm not curriculum liaison this year doesn't mean I can't pick up the phone and call Scott or Barbara or Jen or Cheryl and say, hey, what about thus and so? But it just helps to know that there is a board member who's talking with the administrator and that they're sharing those different perspectives. So that's kind of where we are. I also think another point of success for the district is we've felt how it feels in this district with our particular culture, our particular operational culture. Sometimes it's really easy to get suspicious when there are 2 board members meeting with someone and all of a sudden something comes up and it seems like those 2 board members shaped it too much. And the other three of us are like, well, hey, wait a minute. I wanted to be part of that too. And I feel like I was left out. That can happen. And we're good at those kind of feelings here. And that's actually a plus because it just underscores the commitment and the engagement that each of the 5 board members has for all of the areas of operations. So it's in many ways a smoothing model. It's a communications model. It's a bridge building model. And it's a model that I'm sure superintendents coming in, like John Kellogg, are surprised by when they get here and have to come to understand why it works here and how we make such a loosely structured program and model work so well all these years since 1976. What did I leave out, Mark?
I don't think you left anything out. For the record, I was not here in 1976, Reverend Bell.
Neither was I.
I just want to put that up front. No, I wasn't. But I agree. On having been on the other side of that, as Dr. Nestor Baker said, she was a part of that since 1991. I've been on the other side of that since 94. And close to 76, John, but not there. So I agree with everything Nancy said. I think I've seen it kind of shift and change just a little bit. I mean, we have the core, as Nancy described. We went through time period. Fortunately, we're not in that time period now, which Reverend Bell, I'm happy to see the board along with the district with our restructuring of the organization all coming together at the same time. Typically, these types of things occur during difficult times when we're having to make some difficult decisions in terms of employment and different things that we're doing organizationally. During those periods of times, we did have several committees where a board member who was on a liaison to a certain area would serve on committees within that area when we were looking at the different, reductions or things that need to be made. And that was more, I think, for distributing the workload, because it was impossible for the board to be involved with all of those details as a whole with each of the different areas. But I do think, just Mark's opinion, I do think with the restructuring and the reorganization that we're currently in the middle of, or hopefully towards the end of, but we're in that process, I think this is a great time and opportunity for the board to go through a process of having this conversation and potentially aligning to the structure that the board has been involved with in terms of what we're doing administratively.
That's a good point, Mark, and I should have raised that. We have some, I guess what I call standard positions that seem to be there, personnel or HR. It's been the same thing, just has a little different name now. Curriculum has been curriculum, it's been curriculum and instruction, it's been academic achievement and curriculum, but there's always been that curricular core. Finance is always there. Communication has been one sometimes. We now have community engagement, but when we've had communication, it has been more along the lines of helping to, as if Greg really needed our help, helping to establish what sort of communications, what kind of messages and so forth might be needed at any given point in time. So there are core things, but as boards come along and as the district reshapes itself and ebbs and flows in whatever area, other liaison positions come in for a time and then go away. It just depends on what the board, typically the board president, wants to do. It's one of the few perks that the board president actually has. You don't get to do a whole lot when you're board president that sets you apart from any other board member, except you get to speak for the board, which is, I don't know if that's a get to or an oh my gosh, you got to kind of thing. And there just isn't a whole lot to do, but you do have the satisfaction of appointing liaison positions. And as I say, that's one of the few things that the board president gets to do. If you read through our bylaws, you saw that nowhere in there does it say anything about liaisons. And Mark, I felt ancient again because we used to say it eons ago back in the almost dark ages. But we no longer have that in. Some of the things that we have as established practice here no longer show up in our policies after we went to Neola, which is fine. I'm not going to complain about Neola tonight. I'm not. It's just we have to ensure that our specific cultural practices within this district either remain or in some way are, I don't want to say memorialized, written down somewhere. How's that?
And I think too, if I can add to that, I think that some of the different pieces as they've changed have, the liaison positions have changed with titles in different departments. Over the years, and I know we've had some one-on-one conversations, and a couple of us had a conversation. The one area that seems to always, it comes and goes more frequently, in my opinion, is the policy liaison piece. I would suggest the board have some conversation about, as we're looking at our organizational structure, as we're looking at trying to ensure some succession planning throughout our administrative ranks, which I believe what we have right now will accomplish that. I don't know that there's a better way for the board to be able to do the same types of things, but without ensuring that policy component is a priority and potentially has an official liaison piece. Be in the past, how that's worked, if a board member is a liaison with a particular office or department, they would be involved with that executive director or assistant superintendent to work on that policy. But at the same time, if there's a policy liaison post, so to speak, that gives someone else an opportunity to work with that. And over the year, I know Nancy and I have done that over the years in terms of working together in various different ways when it comes to policy. But I would encourage the board to consider that as an opportunity for the board to continue to have that succession planning type of thing. And ultimately, that's the board's main role is policy. So.
One more thing, and then I promise I'll shut up at least for 5 minutes. If you think about what Mark and I have been saying about the way the liaison roles shape and operate here, it requires the superintendent to take a significant leap of faith to embrace the liaison model that we use. When you read our bylaws, it talks about how all communication from all staff members, basically at all times, has to go through the superintendent to get to us. And that is normal in school districts. That's the way it is. But the liaison model, while it doesn't go against that policy, it does provide a broadening of the way that's played out. So when I talk to Dr. Hopkins, I know that anything that he and I talk about can be told to the superintendent, of course, but for any superintendent to just say, go ahead, board, meet with all the administrators you want, talk to anybody you want to talk to, is a significant leap of faith. And the majority of the years that I'm aware of, it has been successful. And I just wanted to point that out. When I think about the culture that allows a liaison model to thrive, it cannot thrive unless the superintendent is on board with it and comfortable with it, at least to a significant degree.
So where are the sticking points for you as superintendent in the liaison model? And I'm almost setting that question up, and I shouldn't. Are there sticking points in the liaison model for you?
For me, no. I think I like that we're having the conversation and clarifying it. I think what we need is clarity for the folks that are going to be the liaison from the administrative side, because those roles and people change over time, as do yours. And so kind of back to Dr. Nestor Baker's point, I'll use the term codify. Something that codifies what this thing's supposed to be would be very helpful for new board members for orientation and for new administrators in their roles. So what are they supposed to be doing? You know, what are the boundaries of that relationship, and what are the stated purposes of the design, so that there's clarity there. You know, there's a lot of positive where I think it can, what pitfalls I wrote down would be things like sense of isolated knowledge, which I think you kind of attached to Dr. Nestor Baker when you talked about, wait a second, somebody knew something and somebody else didn't. Singular influence, I think you kind of referenced that, someone appearing to have influence. And these aren't things we've experienced, but I think those are the potential pitfalls that people could perceive. And I think, so what's helpful is this conversation, so we come out of this with a shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. The administrators know what the purpose is, what the expectations are, what kind of information. The board knows what they're looking for. And the other thing I see in here a little bit is, being a new board member is really, taking a drink from the fire hose, so to speak, right? There's all this stuff that goes on. And there is also baked into this the opportunity for learning for board members as they come on and spend some time learning about the big chunks of work that go in the district. Who's leading them? What are they doing? What are their goals? So I think that's a potential benefit function that you could put into this thing as well over time if you thought about it. Or we need to front load that piece with new board members coming in saying, this is what the role is, this is what you'll be doing. And the last thing I was thinking about is, as we talk about this, is how do you use this for sharing of information between board members in an effective way, so that we don't get into isolation and separate tracks, but there's it's used to bring broader understanding amongst 5 people who are very busy with all kinds of things in their life. They can't just do board stuff all the time, right? But from, on that, I just think if there's clarity about it, which I think we can do, and we make sure that is more routine in what we do, that would be helpful.
It's interesting, your second point is almost the one that I took as the first point when I first joined the board. Your second point was it's an educational process. Like you can't bite on the whole thing. Okay, this is the board and you got all these different areas. We're going to let you have a couple of liaison positions so that you can learn about those two things. I really, for me, when I came in early on, I learned a lot more about the process, community engagement and communication, and probably looked at that more deeply when I came in, and then actually was in some meetings with Greg this past COVID, because things were unfolding pretty quickly, and hiring a new person, and hey, Rick, do you want to be in a part? So it was just a good learning process, and I don't know if that's supposed to be an order of business, but it's been invaluable to me.
If I could add just a little bit, and I agree with what John said, and Nancy's, I know she and I have experienced this before. Sometimes these liaison positions have been used to, when needed, increase communication. And I think one of the keys and one of the big pieces to this is ensuring through the superintendent that communication is there. And just as an example, because it's something we were actually talking about today that we've got coming up, Mrs. Davidson was on the facilities committee where we were taking a look at the different pieces to the South project. And I know there's thousands of examples. This is just one that was fresh in my mind, where she would have the minutes from that meeting that Jennifer kept sent to the whole board. And I think that's a key piece, and I think that's probably has a lot to do with the success of this in Westerville, where it may not be as successful everywhere else, is the communication component of that. Because if the liaison and the administrator are working in isolation and there isn't communication, that's when you'll see some breakdown in that. So I think it's important for the board and the superintendent to be aware of the happenings within those conversations and those meetings so that everybody's on the same page. And I think it enhances and has helped sustain the concept of the liaisons.
It does. And another thing that we've used, it goes with the communication piece, is when something comes onto the agenda that deals with where your liaison position is. Sometimes we do this, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we've been successful in past years, sometimes we haven't. We will turn to the liaison and say, is there anything you'd like to add about this? And that is a good time for that liaison to say, well, Just so you know, I did meet with XYZ. We had discussion about ABC, and that liaison position then infuses the public discussion that's before the board as well. So that is another way that the communication occurs.
I'm wondering, has there been any past history of linking liaison role to board comments that are part of our agenda as well? And whether or not that linkage has ever been made where part of the board comments piece is a little bit of briefing about, as a board liaison, you know, meeting with X, and right now within that area, we're working on these things, and share that with the public. And it doesn't have to be much other than, you know, an offering of some of the things going on that may not be part of the board agenda, but it'd be worth noting that, you know, this is being worked on. This is where we are with hiring, or any of those things. I'm wondering if that's ever been linked. So
Yeah,
not
it's
just
been
across
tried
the
a couple
board.
of times.
Yeah.
It's never lasted, not because nobody had anything worth hearing, but because of the press of time. So it was one of those things, you know, for instance, back in our early days, we would still be in meetings at 11:30 at night, and it was time to leave. So, you know, things based on the press of the agenda, the kind of standard liaison reports would fall by the wayside. But yeah, we have tried it a couple times. You know, maybe we can figure out a different way so that it doesn't eat up the whole agenda.
So the reason I like to pass the notes along is because it gives you guys something concrete to look at. And then if you have additional questions, then you can go to that person or to me. That was my thought behind it, of sharing those things.
Yeah, I appreciate those notes too.
Okay, so thank you, because I had no idea it went back that far.
We didn't either.
So that's some of the history that's gotten us to where we are. I imagine over the course of that time, probably just about every configuration of it that you could think of has happened at some point in time. And so what I'd like for us, for us as the current board to do is to have a conversation now about, okay, so what would we like it to look like now? How do we think it will best operate and serve us and the district and our community now? Well, I'll leave it. So I'll leave it open and very free flowing. So would you like to discuss how we think it should work, or would you like to define what areas we think need to have a liaison and then define how it works and what it looks like? Or would you like to define it first and then pick? Anybody? Somebody?
Talk about areas first.
Okay. Right now, as we all have a copy of them. We have operations and facilities, and those liaisons are Ms. Altman and myself. Community engagement and communication is Mr. Velardo. Curriculum and academic achievement is Ms. Davidson. Human resources, Ms. Altman and Dr. Nestor Baker. Legislation, Mr. Velardo. Finance is Dr. Nestor Baker. And policy right now is all of us. So there's no specific liaison, but policy is addressed with us as a board as a whole. So those are the current areas.
Do we have a copy of the new org chart? I know I'm just trying to picture it in my head how the different piece of, oh, you know what? I have it in my email. Forget it.
Well, I was going to say, I don't have a hard copy of it, but as we've looked at streamlining the different areas of our district, we have reporting to the superintendent's office. We have operations, which would encompass human resources. I see that's a separate item here. We have curriculum and academic achievement is another area, and then we have communications. Those are the three offices that report to the superintendent's office.
I was looking at the administrators who are attached to the current, as I think kind of getting to where Ms. Davidson's asking. So operations facility obviously is the assistant superintendent. Communication is executive director Gregory Brands. Curriculum and academic achievement assistant superintendent Dr. Hopkins that we made in January. Human resources, which does fall underneath the assistant superintendent for operations, but I think the magnitude of that work as the district work is worth separating out. So you have an executive director there, currently Steve Mazzi. And then finance, of course, Ms. Marshall, the treasurer. The others are kind of not embedded in. I think the other areas of the organizational chart that might have consideration might be areas like equity and student well-being would be two other potential areas for consideration as we think about the org chart. Which one? Teaching and learning, yeah.
Are there other areas that board members that you think would be beneficial to have a liaison representing us and to communicate back with fellow board members?
I do think it's important to keep finance. We're moving along fairly smoothly, if you can ever say that finance moves smoothly, but we're moving fairly smoothly, but it's really important to have that board voice as we begin to look strategically and to have sounding boards with each other. And legislation is clearly very important. There have been a number of times through the years when we have not had a legislation liaison. Yes, I would say probably the majority of the years that I was on the board, we did not have one. Yeah, it is. But things weren't always quite as interesting as they are now. Yeah. So I think that we definitely need to keep those. And of course, I do want us to have the discussion about policy that Mark and I both keep haranguing about.
Why wouldn't we have a separate policy person?
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know why we don't. I'm not sure why we
I think the
wouldn't.
reasoning is, and John, you might have much more to say about this than I would, but the reasoning is that because policies impact so many and come from so many different areas, the idea theoretically is that the policies could flow through the liaisons to the board members. And theoretically, I think that makes really good sense. Practically, I'm not sure it makes the kind of sense that we're talking about because policy is so specific. And the way policies must be crafted, the things that have to be in the policies, the language that should be used, should not be used, blah, 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 all those kind of things. Even, just the example that I gave you earlier, the fact that over the years, as we didn't have a policy person, liaisons fell out of the policy book. There are things that's a small piece, but there are things that fall away when there's not somebody working on, as Mark called it, the succession planning that policy actually is. It's more than just what's happening in the district now. Policy is about years into the future, as well as honoring what needs to be kept from the past.
It just feels like, and really, I'm not going to go to the mat on it either way. I'll let you and Mark go to the mat for it. But it seems to me that allowing it to be, well, that's kind of everybody's responsibility. In my understanding of organizational culture, when you say it's everybody's responsibility, it kind of slips through. And you have somebody to oversee policy. Well, okay, who do I go to for this one? Well, that one has a liaison position, so I'll go to the director and the liaison position. Okay, that one doesn't have a liaison position. Okay, I'll go to the director, and that's not something I'm going to sink any money into. Not that I'm a gambling person, but I'm not sure it makes sense to not have somebody watching the detail minutia. It's not administrivia. It's not unimportant. It's the footer. And if you don't have somebody caring for the footer of the structure, things leak. Well, that was pretty good.
Yes, it was. I like that. You should be the facilities liaison.
And I don't favor one way or the other, but the flip side of that is true too, in that when you have a policy, so if you have a policy that's affecting HR, where does it go? Does it go to the HR and the HR liaison for their discussion, or does it go to the liaison for policy, and the person right now would be the deputy, be Mark? So you have that same where does it go problem, who's responsible, and shared, and it's a shared, and that, it doesn't matter to me, I just think it's clear definition.
So when I look at this org chart, and I mentioned this to Vaughn earlier, so it's the board, and then it has Dr. Kellogg, and then leadership working with Dr. Kellogg, which when you meet with leadership every other week, you have Nicole, Mark, John, so you're getting finance, policy, the entire district, board leadership, I'm just pointing right now. Those would be the people then I would think that the liaison position should be: finance, policy, what else would fit under there? I mean, because they're getting a little bit of everything else. And then if you look at the other three big pieces, which we're doing already, curriculum, facilities, communication, those are the next three pieces. And then the things that fall underneath it, I would think we would be responsible for, knowing that everything still kind of goes up and through you three to leadership, whoever is sitting in leadership. So I don't know. I think that might be a good way for all of us to be responsible for an area. And then as we have meetings and share thoughts, and I always thought the liaison position was just the sharing of information, simply, then that's just shared throughout, whether it is at a board meeting or sharing notes, whatever anyone is comfortable with, and it can be done multiple different ways. But that's just my vision of the breakdown and who's responsible. Because you guys are working with each piece in there, so policy would impact each piece in there. I don't know. Thoughts?
That is a satisfying model. However, all right. I'm thinking about how I would react to it, and I know a lot of this I'm saying tonight, I apologize for saying, well, back in the day. But I can think of times during my tenure on the board, not during these past years, overall, when I haven't been as tightly engaged with the rest of the board as I was other years.
Sure.
And the liaison positions actually help bring board members into a clearer sense of equality. Because if we funnel a number of the liaison roles to whoever's in the board leadership chairs, then those are fewer roles that are available for the board members who are not in the leadership roles that year. So one of the things, and I should have said this when I was talking about the liaison history, one of the things that liaison positions have been used to do is to ensure that board members all have equity in role insofar as possible. So that's another part of our culture is in some districts, the board president is this godlike creature who has all powers and does all things, and that's never been Westerville. That is not who we are, and I'm sure you, until this year, yes, that's true, there is Vaughn, yes.
Off
But-
with their head.
But the liaison roles give us the opportunity to equalize roles and to avoid lifting the president and vice president beyond what they should have culturally.
So I hear what you're saying. I think this kind of does the same thing, because if you're meeting with Nicole, even if we're going over a 5-year forecast, she calls each of us. So we still know what's happening there. I would say the same with the policy piece. We're all voting on the policy. After that first reading, if we're not okay with something, that gives us each the opportunity to have some input. As far as John relaying information, I feel like he's doing that with all of us anyhow. I was thinking it was one way, you were already meeting with them anyhow. I think that was my original idea, like, oh, these pieces fit. I was trying to make it a puzzle.
So let me see if I caught what you were thinking. So board leadership, the liaison of policy, finance, and legislation would be a function of what happens in board leadership with the board president and vice president. The other, so that leaves those two people who are in those positions functioning there. The other ones, I just did it this way, academics, operations, and facilities in HR, which are the three other big chunks of work, would then be allocated to the other three board members as their liaison role.
I didn't have legislation in there.
That's a great place for us to do that, because oftentimes that's flowing through Nicole and I anyway.
We bring it up with board leadership.
Yeah. So the idea of, that's part of our agenda. We, of course, provide information to the rest of the board about what we're talking about through board leadership. So that's one way of kind of mobilizing this and building on a structure that's already in there, right? So we go through the board meeting, and these are things coming, and then you take the other three, and those that are not, and board president and vice president would have the academic. I still think of all the things we have, the big chunks are the academics, the operations and facilities, and HR. I mean, that's a big chunk of the work. That's one way to do it, because part of the problem is there's more areas of liaison than there are board members.
Right.
You can feel that way sometimes, or you let something go, or they were doubling up. Maybe that's a way to do it. Is that kind of how you were thinking about it?
Yeah, I was. So it was kind of already established, right? You know the next year what your, potentially, what your roles are. So,
I just feel like it gives too much, I feel like it puts those board leadership meetings on a different plane. Because, yeah, the things are talked about in board leadership, but I feel like we have to be careful about what all we talk about in board leadership so it doesn't go to a greater extent. Because board leadership, the predominant reason for board leadership meetings is the agenda. Yeah. And obviously, all these things flow into setting the agenda, and there are other pieces that, impact that. I don't want, for the five of us, and whoever the five may be that come along, I don't want them to, even with notes and so forth from board leadership, I don't want them to feel that the president and vice president have too much within their sphere. As nice as that can be sometimes.
What if you pull the legislative piece out, which doesn't have a particular, other than Nicole and I, there's no particular administrator whose function is legislation. The rest of them have a key executive team member who leads that. So you could pull out the legislative piece, make that part of an update that goes on at board leadership to share with the rest of the board. This is what we, for example, House Bill 1 today, House Bill 67 on Wednesday, right? And this litany of stuff that's coming. That could function within there. Take the other five and distribute, if you look at the other five as where you want to go, distribute the other five.
So I'm thinking about, this may not make sense, I'm just thinking out loud here. Legislation and community engagement and communication, and whether those two things are really so potentially intertwined that they could be one role. I mean, right now we have one person doing them, so I guess now that Rick has just put something in his mouth, I would ask him to speak to that with the perfect timing. So with community engagement and communication liaison role, and then the legislation liaison role, like I'm just thinking through, what is the legislation liaison, which I did some of that last year. A lot of it really is about communication and with the community, mobilizing the community when we want people to do outreach on legislative issues, House bills pending. I'm just wondering whether those are so closely aligned that they really are one liaison role, because I've been writing them down here, and then we have somebody mentioned, well, there's the potential for equity, and I know we have board members who are on the district equity team, and so like I was coming up with the problem of too many liaison roles and not enough board members. Right, yeah. So let's expand the board, right? No. So I'm just wondering, in your mind, because you do both of those things, whether they're really separate or not.
Yeah, communications is about legislation, certainly, but since it's that area, say Greg and Charlie, it's also about how to design communications so that when we go back all in, everybody knows where they're supposed, so not legislation. Now, the reason I have always liked doing them was because there was overlap. Number one, and number two, I just enjoy the community engagement communication process, and I'm pretty passionate and interested in the legislative side. So they were just a natural fit. But to your question, like communication deals with legislation, right? House bills and all that. But it also deals with a lot of stuff that is not legislatively connected. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that's how they have always worked together in my mind. That's why I've enjoyed those areas.
Right, together. Yeah, I guess that was the question I was thinking through is legislation. There are certainly aspects of it that aren't community engagement and communication, but as far as the board member's role in that legislation piece, is it really under the umbrella mostly of community engagement and communication?
Yes, I think so. And John's exactly right. My involvement in the legislative piece, it's what we were doing last year, you and I were doing last year. Just try to watch the legislative landscape, and if something popped up, say, oh, to the board, did you notice that? Did you notice that? Now, frankly, the two of them are deeply tied into that. So that's kind of the liaison. If I saw something they didn't see, didn't happen much, I would say it to them. If they saw something I didn't see happen frequently, they would say it to me, and we could kind of get that word out. That's the way it functioned for me. I don't know that I would fold them into one, but it's the same thing with the policy deal. I like what we have. I like what I'm doing, but I'm here to do whatever we end up doing.
Well, thanks. That's helpful.
I think that some of the liaison positions are more intensive than others. Curriculum can be very intensive. You have not only the meetings that you have with our administrators, but also just sitting in on curriculum council meetings and so forth. So curriculum can be a lot of time. Um,
Well, operations, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead and interrupt.
The amount of time that she's put in
Yes.
this last year.
Yes.
She, meaning Tracy. And
Yeah, so there's certain ones that take up a chunk of time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they take up more time than they do other years. So that's kind of like if we have the big umbrella things, it can be, at the beginning of the year when the president is deciding who is assigned to what, it can say, finance is going to be a big deal this year. We're going to be on the ballot. We've got to do a lot of talking. So do you have time to do finance and HR? Because HR runs along fairly smoothly. You don't typically have massive amounts of meetings you go to for HR. So, you kind of have to balance each year what the workload is in that particular operational area. As 2 is fine. It just depends on what those 2 are. As if, for instance, if Tracy decided not only did she want curriculum, but she wanted her facilities piece back too, that would just be nuts. That's a lot of work. But doing curriculum and HR at this point in time, or doing HR and operations and facilities, that's workable. Doing policy and community engagement communications is doable. In other words, it's just a function of what kind of time each board member has to give and what the workload is looking like in that particular year. So that's one thing I want us to be careful that we don't get too rigid in setting out what things are, because we want to be able to ebb and flow with what the workload is that's going on. And we also want to make sure that the board president does actually get that perk of assigning liaison positions. Well, maybe we don't want the board president to get that perk. I don't know.
So as we talk about clarifying expectations, what you're saying, Nancy, makes me think that maybe one expectation we could clarify, it's not existing right now, but you just brought this up, is that the administration and the board leadership really sits down at the beginning of the year and looks at, what are likely to be the very busy liaison positions for that year. And so that it's part of a process where every year there's a conversation around that to really identify where they think the bulk of the work will be. And then as the president is, assigning liaison positions, there's a little clarity instead of like, okay, well, here's the list, pick what you want. Right? It would help me then to know, well, what does the administration think is going to be really heavy areas of work this year? And maybe some areas that might be lighter. That would help me decide, just from a process point of view.
It would also help new board members decide what they could do. The educational component is a really important part of the liaison model. We always used to start people in personnel because the expectation was if you didn't know how the district was structured as regards all of the people, you could never make sense of any of it. I know finance is where you would start everyone, but if you didn't know personnel, even finance didn't quite make sense. It's just the educational role is something that the board president takes into account also in saying, well, I think so-and-so needs to be here. So-and-so really could use some work here. We're flowing well here, stay there. It's not a highly parametered assignment because it does have that ebb and flow based on workload and on board member capacities and board member and administrator needs.
As we consider that, I think it's also important to highlight that if we were to assign specific roles to board leadership, that would constitute a change in the dynamics, in the nature of what the board leadership meeting looks like. Because right now, the board leadership meeting is geared towards setting the agenda for the upcoming meeting. And we, for the most part, don't go beyond that. This is what the agenda looks like. These are some highlights of that, things board members may need to be aware of, and that's it.
My comment was, though, just having the access. I wasn't saying that you would discuss all of those things during board leadership. I was saying typically during board leadership, the 5-year forecast, you make appointments or you kind of go over tidbits of it, right? So it was just that you had the touches with those 3 people. I was just trying to align people. That's all I was doing, not saying those meetings needed to take place during board leadership. So.
Is there anything in our current list of liaison positions that you think should go away? Or are you all happy with that list as it is right now? And equity ought to be on the list, I guess, as well, because we do have carryover from last year on that. We don't have student well-being, but of the ones we have, do you see those as strong components within the org chart? I'm just trying to kind of shrink wrap some of the discussion a little bit.
I think, and this kind of goes along with part of our conversation when we were talking about this, that perhaps some things that we would consider creating a new liaison position for can be included in existing liaison descriptions. And for instance, equity. Okay, yes, but equity could also be folded into or included with human resources. Student well-being could very easily become a part of the function for the curriculum and academic achievement liaison. And so perhaps, it's defining what each one of what we would like each one of the positions to cover. Then some of the things that we think are missing would help clarify, and we can plug them in.
It makes a lot of sense to me in that I don't see anything on this list that I think doesn't belong here. I think, again, I guess it's probably related to my last comment, but I feel like a little bit more process, and I'm kind of process oriented, but at the beginning of each year to lay out, okay, well, these are our basic liaison appointments, but here are some big issues we know going on this year. Where do they fit, right? That would be very, very helpful to me.
Some of that could be tied specifically to goals of the organization and where they heavy laid. So, for example, in this case this year with equity education and our work with district equity teams, which has far-reaching across a couple of areas, those goals are baked into some of the work, and so that's where those questions come from. For example, facilities, when we were, now we're implementing what we had. When we were planning for all that, that was a lot more work. It's still a lot of work now, but it's, and there's a lot to be paid attention to, but it's rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's still big. So I think that idea of at the start of the year, the board president and maybe the superintendent, the treasurer, through board leadership, we talk a little bit about not just the liaison roles and what big chunks of work are there, but what are the goals of the organization and where do they play out there? That's going to make that work more important. So it becomes then clarification for the administrators involved in, well, what's the scope of what we're talking about here? Because you can feel like, should I tell everything? Am I supposed to? And that's impossible to do. But if it's, for example, I'll take HR and equity for a second. If we know we're working on a more diverse staff, what are some of the strategies going on? What is the district doing to enhance that work in HR? Where are we in terms of that, in terms of curriculum and academic achievement? Where are we at in terms of student wellness? So I think you can start to link those things together where there's clarity around what we're trying to work on, where it's impacting the organization, and that's a real core part of the conversation. And that'll dictate magnitude of the work, too.
So I would agree. I don't see anything on the list that I think should go away. I think perhaps what we may need to do is clarify the definition of what we mean by, some of these titles, and what we expect in terms of responsibilities and areas covered. But I don't see anything that should go away.
I don't either. And my policy head is saying we really need to get this in policy. Again, bring back, something, whether it's in our organizational meeting, whether it's whatever policy we want to put it in, or if we want it to have its own policy that in appropriate terms lays that out. So it basically says, at the after the organizational meeting or at the beginning of each calendar year, the board president will meet with senior staff and discuss the liaison positions for the year and identify how those fit with district goals. Then as liaison positions are assigned, the anticipated focus will be shared with board members so that informed decisions can be made, however we want to say it, but bring it back into a function of bylaws for the board. Because when it's not a bylaw, it can just go wherever, and does. So that's, my thinking around that. I would suggest that we take the things that were said tonight and draft some policy language around that, and then bring that back for the board to discuss. And that goes with what we always tried to do, Mark, which is to Westervillize our policy manual. A lot of our policies are not necessarily Westervilleized, and this goes to where I disagree with John's flip side view of policy liaison work. When I read the majority of our policies are, should be, and are expected to be in line with requirements from the state, requirement from the feds, etc. We got to have these policies. What we lose sight of, though, are the ones that talk specifically about us, not us, the board necessarily, but us, Westerville. And that's kind of sets that umbrella of who we are within all of those requirements that we have to have. Most policies have nothing specific to do with Westerville. They are about how we implement what we're told to implement. But there are things that we can do and slants that we can put on and languages we can use that Westervillize our policies. And so that brings me straight back around to, I'd like to ask Mark, if everybody else thinks it's a good idea to work on a liaison policy, and then I would like us to go back to the discussion of policy and where it sits in liaisons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it would be, I would like to see that happen, and I think there'd be some really good conversation, and I'm not trying to open a conversation, I'm just giving an example here. For example, is it the outgoing board leadership that really knows what's coming up the next year and can help flesh out those descriptions, and then the new board leadership can help assign liaison positions, or does the fleshing out happen with the new board leadership, right? Not that that would necessarily be in policy, but those are productive kinds of conversations to me. Like, who really knows the lay of the land? How should this work? I think it would be really beneficial as a board to have the conversations around creating a policy that we would need to have.
Yeah, I think that this meeting, as Vaughn and I were talking about this meeting, we talked about the liaisons as a good place for us to really launch into board development work for us, because it is something that we all have experience with, and it is something that we all have opinions on, and gives us an opportunity to really play with the different philosophies behind liaison approaches, and lets us begin to shape things. Because as we look at what happens with board development, it's not unusual for policy change to come from that discussion. And so this kind of laid itself out as an important thing to talk about now, but also important for the future to lay out the parameters going forward, so it's not just in the wind.
I think it is. It's a very important ongoing discussion that we need to have. One of the things that struck me when I first came on the board, I knew there was a lot I didn't know, but I didn't know how much I didn't know. And so one of the first things you get is told, okay, yeah, you're the liaison for this area, now go liaise. It's like, okay. So, I'm sitting in a meeting with one of our administrators, and I'm kind of like, okay, what are we supposed to do here? And they looked at me and they're like, I don't know. I thought you were going to tell me what we were supposed to do here. And I'm like, okay, so how often am I supposed to communicate with my fellow board members? What do you even want from me? I don't even know what. So we're sitting there and I'm like, I don't even know what questions to ask. So what am I supposed to do here? And so I think helping to get some of that information put down in terms of policy for us will be very beneficial, not only for new board members as they are onboarded onto the board, but also as a reminder for us as existing board members, okay, these are the expectations, so this is what I'm expected to do. Am I supposed to meet monthly? Am I supposed to meet quarterly? I don't know, because it's like, okay, well, what do y'all want? and what really gets hilarious, when you ask that question, everybody goes, that's a good question. So I thought it would be good for us to have dialogue and discussion together to determine what are our expectations of each other, so that we know, so that we can fulfill those obligations.
I feel like that's almost a segue to the second part of this, right? One is like the longer term view and policy around this. The shorter term view from where I am is like, my name is next to two of these, and I'd really like to go through that process we just talked about, where the board leadership and the administration sort of align, what goals kind of fall under each of these this year in the shorter term. Because I think that would help answer the question. I feel like, to me, it's a little prescribed to say, okay, you have to meet with your liaison quarterly or whatever, because that really depends on what the goals are under that role for that year. That, to me, that's where it should come from. That's where my guidance should come from. It's not about like, and I know you're just throwing that out there, it's not about a certain frequency of meetings, or it's about what are we trying to do, right? So in the shorter term, I know it's March. Even for this year, we still have a lot of months left. That would be really helpful for me to have Dr. Kellogg have more work to do and think about. That was getting slow right about now. Yeah, next Monday it'll be really slow. Just where are the district goals and how do they align with the pieces that I'm supposed to be the liaison for?
So I was thinking about that and timing in this, because we've traditionally, I'm sure there's a reason for it, done this in the turnover in January, which is like our schedule runs differently. And is there any consideration to when we make the switches? Because the role of the board in helping determine the goals and what's coming. So if we looked at how we align that, so superintendent and his leadership team, as they're thinking about the coming year, prepare some information around these areas and what we see as goals and what I call areas of focus. So, for example, in the fall of '22, we're going to open a new elementary school, right? So there's going to be a whole lot of discussion about how do we staff that, right? What are the processes, contract? So that's going to come, and that'll be bigger than what we normally see, right? So, and I'm fine leaving it mid-year too, if that's what you prefer, but I think there's some alignment in there we could do too. But it gives us, because this is about the time of year we start talking about next year, right? We're like, okay, so next year we got boom, 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 boom. We start to define the district goals. Last year, as we were getting into it, we end up with equity as our goal. That was defined as we ended the year. It helps our administrators and out there who are doing stuff knowing what we're doing. So it's a way to put it all together. What are the big areas of focus, goals, and those may not be exactly the same thing. Lay that out, put that in place. I kind of like the idea, and maybe it's just me, of putting that changeover in liaison roles going into the summer, end of a school year, as opposed to mid-January, but I don't know how you all feel.
I had the same thought, that it's kind of difficult to do, or a little more challenging to do on a calendar year versus a school year. And so that was going to be my next question, was would you be comfortable with us making that kind of a shift in terms of the liaison assignments?
And our treasurer currently has a fiscal year that, as John was just describing, a lot of the work that we're doing, I think Nicole's, I don't even want to know how many budget meetings she's put on my calendar for the next 3 weeks, but so there is a lot of alignment if you went with a July 1 instead of a January 1.
I think it'd be fine. As I think about the history of the liaisons, there have been times, not in these recent years, that the assignment of liaisons has been used to boost support for someone to be elected as president. So this placing the liaisons, switches, assignments, or whatever in the summer, in some way removes that political aspect of liaison assignments. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. We are a political body, but I do think it's important to think about that. That could actually be a benefit. Did you think of that when you said it?
Didn't think about that at all. I was more about congruence with, we've spent a lot of time calendaring out our goal-setting process in our district with our administrators to get away from, hey, welcome back in August, what are your goals for this year? And all of a sudden it's November, and, and last year was a mess because of COVID, but we had gotten pretty good about getting to the point where as people are exiting for the year, they were exiting with thoughts of what they're going to be working on next year. And I think that's worked well for us. It works well from a finance side. And it means when you start engaging your staff and bringing people back in August, you kind of set where you're at. And that's where it was coming from. The other piece I didn't.
Well, it really didn't have anything to do with you.
I didn't even,
Yeah, but you just put that in the history bucket as well. It has served a political purpose as well. and it would remove that.
I mean, I can't really see any negatives to it, except, of course, when you bring new board members on, but they would just, pick up the empty liaison seat for a small number of months. That's it. I really don't see any other downside to it. It makes just a ton of sense on the face of it to me.
I think it would
To
be
align it.
easier on the administrators, quite a lot
Yes, I
easier on
think
the
so.
administrators.
Well, I think on us as board members as well. Because if, with it being at the beginning of the year, with those assignments being at the beginning of the calendar year, we're splitting the year. So we come into it halfway through whatever the department is working on, we're coming into it in the middle of it. And then you exit the role halfway through whether or not you got it done or not. So I like the idea. I think it makes sense for us to move in that direction. Any thoughts you had, Mr. Velardo?
I don't know why we wouldn't try it. I go back to what I said earlier. I think these are good liaison positions. I think they're aligned with what we're trying to do. And if starting them at a different time can help in the kind of the administration bridge over the summer, I mean, I could even see, if I was still communication, maybe I talk with Greg once or twice over the summer. How are your goals going when we hit the ground running in September? I don't do anything over the summer. I'd be glad to hang tough. I don't know why we wouldn't try it. Let's try something.
I think it's fine. So do we want to put this into play, codify this for next year? In other words, we just want to, since we've got these now, and we've told the administrators, and we've met with them, do we want to keep on doing it, or do we want, to say in policy that we anticipate that liaisons are announced at the end of the school year, so that there's preparation for the next year? But this year would be different, because we would just run it out.
Yeah, we just stick with the ones we have for a little extra long here.
Yeah,
That
instead of
would
being
make
extra
sense.
short.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would make sense.
I like it. So we can make that adjustment.
So we're not doing it this year, you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
Now, there will be what happens when their board member, that turnover. So we will have people coming in, possibly every 2 years. This would be a stutter. And so people would start a liaison in January. So we have the potential of often having people out of sync.
Mm-hmm.
So that's there too.
So from a timeline, we can work on the policy piece, get that in play over the next couple weeks, get that codified in place. At the same time, our team will be starting to project out to next year, goals, major areas of focus by these areas, and be ready for June for a transition going into the next school year. So you keep as you are rather than changing tonight or changing between now and then. Just keep running the way you are. We'll get to when we get to, and we'll put it in the policy when that switchover happens. The first June meeting or the last May meeting. First June meeting might work better. That would be a timing piece moving forward.
Yeah, I do want to think about it more, because at first when you put it out there, I thought, that's a really good idea. I like it a whole lot. But I am a little concerned about the stutter steps.
Mm-hmm.
Because, that could be every 2 years. We're out of sync.
But there's going to be a stutter step no matter how you do it, if you have that turnover.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Yeah. I have to think about that.
So do you want it to come in the middle of the year or at the middle of the school year or at the beginning of a calendar year?
Well, new folks come in at the beginning of the new year,
Calendar year.
calendar year. So if new people came in, it's like a double hit kind of thing at the beginning of the year and a new liaison position.
Yes.
Whereas in the middle of the year, the liaison position changes, but the person doesn't change. The personnel doesn't change.
Except for new board members coming in and
Yeah.
old board members leaving, then the prior board members' liaison positions are then empty in January. And
At
the new
the
board
start.
member automatically has to take those.
Yeah, they inherit that role
Yeah,
for the next couple months and then switch.
yeah, which could be tricky, because let's say we were in the middle of a vast, I don't know, let me pick something. Well, pick finance. Yeah, we are getting ready to gear up for a massive campaign, and we throw a new board member in to something that the board member has absolutely no knowledge of. And we can do it, and I'm being devil's advocate, actually, because I think there's a whole lot of benefit starting in the summer, but I'm just wanting to make sure that we don't create a stutter step that is more trouble for the administration and for the board member than it's worth.
Well, I think, to me, really big issues, I would hope we could see a little bit out. So if people think they might be rolling off the board, and of course, when you're up for election, you're never sure. But maybe we could avoid putting people in some of those positions, or we just make sure the policy has a place, where we're talking about how positions might be changed. You know what I mean? So that there's at least some provision for if something happens mid-year, and that could be new board members coming in from election, or someone needs to resign or something, that there's just some provision for how roles would get reassigned with new folks coming in.
And you could also have two people in the liaison position like we're doing now. So that would be the cover also.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, we could do that.
And I'm also
I just don't want us
thinking,
to create committees.
if it's something big, that's something that's going to be discussed. We're all pretty much going to be pretty up on
Yeah.
anything that's big that's going on. So making a change so that the new person either would not be the only liaison serving in that position, or in the position at all of serving where something's big.
Then it becomes almost a mentoring position, and I think that's good. Okay, so we build it in. So when we do this policy, Mark, we gotta also reference the onboarding policy that exists too.
So we'll do that piece, and oh man, I just lost my thought, and it was good too.
Best thought all night, right?
What were we just talking about?
The journey.
Man, okay, maybe.
The policy they're going to work on this process for the mid-year. Is that where you were headed, or later? The policy that you were talking about.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
So while we are working on developing the policy, is it okay that board leadership meets with the administration to bring some definition to some of these roles and bring that back to us for your review as well? Yes, no?
That would be helpful to me,
Okay.
yeah, to align with the big goings-on, I guess would be the technical term, in the district. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. Is there, so those are the two big takeaways. The development of a policy, shifting the assignments being made to the beginning of the school year versus calendar year, and board leadership will meet with administration leaders, and we'll bring back to the board some definitions around the current liaison positions for your review. And we can add, take away, and
Could I recommend somebody work with Dr. Hershiser on this new policy?
sure.
I would recommend that somebody work with you to help you. I elevated you to doctor and you didn't say anything.
I'm listening.
He's more
And
like a lawn doctor.
I don't want to dominate, but Nancy works in that area a lot, and I think she has skills. You guys have worked together. It doesn't matter to me. I just think one person, it just doesn't need to be Mark. Somebody needs to work with them to capture the conversation we just had.
I'd be happy to. The way it typically works, Mark puts stuff together, he sends it, and I say, there. And then it comes to all of us, and we all say, oh, change this or that, or it's dandy, and that's the way it typically works. It's a streamlining and a double-eyed approach.
I like it. Any objections? Okay. That's how we'll go forward. Did you have anything, Ms. Marshall?
I do have a question. So just as we're thinking about, I'm a process person too, so I feel you, Jen. As we're thinking about like the roles with the liaison, are we looking at the liaison working with the administrators as far as goals are concerned for next year? Are we looking at opportunities for learning, or does it just depend on the board member that's in that position? So what I'm trying to think of is like if we do have a new board member, so like for the finance piece that knows nothing about finance, you know, they might not want to be in every finance meeting that we have, but they might want to schedule periodic meetings to learn about various things that might not normally come up in a meeting. And I'm thinking like other pieces like curriculum, they have regularly scheduled meetings pretty often that they have. So there's opportunities there that, you know, that might work into. So I'm just trying to think like structure wise what that would look like or how that would work.
I don't see why it would be an either or. There's always learning. You know, no matter how long we sit here, there's always something we need to learn. So I view it as, you know, we've got goals and we have large focus areas, but there is also that river that flows underneath of all that knowledge that we need to try to swim in. So I view it as an and both thing, as far as possible.
The idea of a more structured onboarding process for new board members, I think, is worthwhile. Whether or not that is some kind of rotational schedule. I mean, you can't take it all in at once, but beginning with, hey, meet Dr. Hopkins and Barb and Scott. So you get to meet the key leaders and spend a little time with them. You know, so now you know who to call as you're engaging and you want to learn and you want to know. So I think we could do a better job there in terms of onboarding as new board members come on, offer that opportunity to set up we could actually have an internal protocol that we build out. Doesn't have to, I don't think it needs to be a policy, but just an internal protocol that we put in place and use that.
I do think that policy needs updated. I read it tonight. before I came over here and thought it needed Westervilleized. But to include the broader language, broad policy language, not guideline language, around those kind of pieces. Because again, if we don't say that that the expectation is that board members will rotate through and kind of like a residency, you do your meetings in these various areas, we won't think about doing it because the policies are where we live. We don't necessarily live in guidelines.
And functionally, at that time of year, mid-year, the things that we laid out around those areas in June that we're working on become let me introduce you to this person, the leadership team, and let me tell you a little bit about what's the work going on right now in that area. So it's focused and then move on. You can't learn it all at that point, but knowing the things that are happening that are important, right, for the new person. Or, yeah.
So does that help, Ms. Marshall?
Yeah, I think it would be useful for us as administrators to think about, like, schedule-wise, like, the kinds of meetings that we have in each of these positions as you're looking at the liaison positions, so that someone is aware of what that workload might entail. As like right now, I'm thinking, with finances, we have the biennium budget that's coming up. We do a forecast twice a year, those things, and lots of legislative pieces that I think touch a lot of different areas in the school system. But I do think the areas that have like regular meetings, like we have audit committee, those sorts of things, it would be helpful for us to put something together for them to have so that they could see that. And also a mechanism for the liaison to be able to share information with the rest of the board. I know, Mark's example with Tracy on the facilities, I think that was something that's a structured, regularly scheduled meeting where we keep notes of, right? So that's, we can easily share those notes out to the board members and things, but that's not always the case, I think, in some of these liaison positions, and trying to think about that and what that would look like.
I would think that one of the ways we continue the communication piece is through the board update, too. So discussions that happen between board liaisons and administrators that lead to, we want to share, and some discussion about, let's make sure that's in the update so the rest of the board hears that. I think continuing that practice, too, because we don't want to create more stuff for people. But I think frequency of meetings, what's that expectation? Who calls it? We need to clarify that for the people working. And I think that can all be administrative. That we set up a expectation of at least once a month, and we can pen that out.
It's doable, yeah.
Defining those responsibilities, so everybody knows. And it doesn't become, because your description felt like my first day of teaching when they said, here's the keys and there's some textbooks in the room, have at it. Back in 1984. A little bit more structure would have been helpful to me.
1984. Yeah, that's what I was just going through in my head. Where was I in 1984?
I'm not mentioning any more dates.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, well, thank you all for your participation and contributions to the conversation this evening. We'll continue on with the remainder of our agenda. Agenda item 8.01, future meetings. The next meeting, the next hybrid virtual Board of Education meeting will be held on Monday, March the 8th, 2021 at 6 p.m. at the Early Learning Center located at 936 East Wind Drive, Westerville, Ohio. Agenda item 9.01, adjourn. May I have a motion and a second, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Marshall, would you please call the roll?
Mrs. Altman,
Yes?
Mrs. Davidson,
Yes?
Mr. Velardo,
Yes.
Dr. Nestor Baker,
Yes?
Mr. Bell.
Yes. Motion carried. We are adjourned.